Have you ever been on a boat? Maybe it was in the middle of an ocean or maybe a lake. Did you ever have that feeling that maybe it could sink? Yeah, well, neither did the passengers of the Titanic. I have pulled information from many outside sources. These include newspaper and journal articles. Many of them were historical newspapers that were written just after the Titanic disaster. All of them either had a credible author or a credible newspaper company like the New York Times and the Scientific American. I have used all this for research on the Titanic. The Titanic is one of the most famous historical events of all time. In this speech, I will inform you of the background of the Titanic, the sinking, and the aftermath of the events. The background of the Titanic is very unknown, and it is also historical. According to the article, The Titanic, The Untold Economic Story, Aron Khanna states, in 1907, the White Star Line decided to build 3 Olympic-class ships, the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Gigantic, which was renamed Britannic. Construction of the Titanic started in 1909. Khanna explained how they were sister ships. They were constructed similarly and around the same time and by the same company. Khanna also explained that there were many people of high society that were either involved with the Titanic by passenger or maybe it was the construction. Mr. and Mrs. Jacob John Astor, writer Albert Hubbard, and Mr. and Mrs. Jasauter Strauss, which they were the owners of Macy's, were all involved with the Titanic somehow. The author Vicky Bassett of Causes and Effects of the Rapid Sinking of the Titanic explained the Titanic's build. It was about 45,000 tons, 2 stories tall, and 900 feet in length. Obviously, that was pretty big at the time, and it was deemed the largest ship ever built around that time. It was also deemed unsinkable by the constructors of the Titanic because they figured that if it were to be punctured by any factor, it would be able to stand for 2 to 3 days without sinking. Bassett also discusses that the Titanic was built by Harland and Wolff and was a White Star Line steamship. Little did they know the Titanic's voyage would come to an abrupt end. The New York Times article, The Tragedy of the Titanic, A Complete Story, explains the maiden voyage of the Titanic. It sailed from Southampton, England on April 10, 1912. The journey would stretch across the Atlantic Ocean toward the New York harbor. The captain, Edward J. Smith, ordered the Titanic to move at full speed throughout the journey to reach New York as fast as possible. Obviously, as we all know, it came to an abrupt end. The disaster of the Titanic is probably the most well-known factor of the Titanic. The article Behavior Under Extreme Conditions, The Titanic Disaster states, during the night of April 14, 1912, the RMS Titanic collided with an iceberg on her maiden voyage. 2 hours and 40 minutes later, she sank, resulting in a loss of 1,501 lives, more than 2/3 of her 2,207 passengers and crew. Then, Martin H. Levinson states in his article, A General Semantics Analysis of the RMS Titanic Disaster, at 11:40 p.m., while sailing around 400 miles south of the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, lookouts spotted a large iceberg directly in Titanic's path. The ship turned left to avoid the iceberg, but the massive chunk of ice opened mortal holes on the starboard side. Bassett of a previous article provides a timeline of these events. On April 14th, the Titanic sideswiped an iceberg at 11:40, which damaged part of the hull. Then the watertight compartment started to fill up and eventually spilled over the transverse bulkheads around midnight. The bow starts to fully sink and the ship actually splits into 2 pieces at around 2 in the morning. At 2:33 a.m., the 2 sides hit the ocean floor. The bow traveled at 13 miles per hour and the stern traveled at 4 miles per hour. Now that you know a little bit about the disaster, you're probably wondering what were some rescue options that were available. The lifeboats were a key factor to the Titanic disaster. The Tragedy of the Titanic, A Complete Story, states, the other fact is that many persons, most of them men, lost their lives needlessly. Not one of the lifeboats which pulled away from the sinking Titanic apparently left with a full cargo. The same article goes on to explain how women and children were called to first because they were probably the most vulnerable and needed the most help. It also talks talks about how many people gave up their spot on the lifeboat so that the young could take over and have a chance. The Titanic sinking was a tragic event, resulting in many deaths, but what came after was very, very beneficial. The events after the Titanic disaster took a turn for the better. The article, Wreck of the White Star Liner, states, "The call for help was heard by several ships, the nearest of which was the Carpathia, which caught the message at 12:35 a.m. Monday, when she was 58 miles distant from the Titanic. Setting an extra watch, the captain crowded on all speed, reaching the disaster by 4 a.m. That article goes on to explain how the Carpathia rescued the remaining lifeboats and people that were aboard the Titanic. In the article, Causes and Effects of the Rapid Sinking of the Titanic, Bassett claims, in an effort to prevent repeating their mistakes, the White Star Line modified several of their existing ships, which included the Olympic and the Britannic, and they constructed them just a little bit different so that the same instance wouldn't happen. Bassett claims that they changed the construction of it in two ways. First, the double bottoms were extended up the sides of the hull to make it thicker. Second, the watertight compartments were raised up a little bit higher so that the water couldn't spill over again. Bassett also discusses the safety regulations that they enforced after the Titanic. A few of them are they increased the lifeboat capacity, ice patrol was implemented, and wireless communication was mandatory. All ships use this nowadays. These all were established to prevent incidents similar to the sinking of the Titanic. After all of these years, only one person was the first to find the wreckage of the Titanic. The article Searching for the Titanic by Lauren Tarshish quotes, on September 1st, using his new remote-controlled submersible, Argo, Robert Ballard discovers the wreck of the Titanic. Tarshish explains, in 1985, he discovered the wreck of the Titanic, and he actually had gone on a first expedition, but it failed due to ship errors, and they had to return home. He obviously tried again, and with the use of top scientists and many of his crew, he was able to find the wreckage of the Titanic. Now that you know a little bit more about this, in this speech I explained the background of the Titanic, the sinking of the Titanic, and the aftermath of the events. You know a little bit about it, so let that information sink in, and maybe think of a time where you were on a boat. Maybe next time it will sink just like the Titanic. Thank you for listening.